when an alpha controls the group, how long generally is their reign? And what happens to them when they get pushed out?
So that's different in different chimp groups across Africa. But at Ngogo, I think like 6-7 years is the average good tenure. There have been chimps who have taken the alpha position but have not done it very well and have been out after a year. There's one chimp there, Bartok, who was in charge for 10 years, but he was very successful alpha and very politically astute. So I think the average at Ngogo is sort of 6 or 7 years. And that's quite a long time.
It's fascinating because it's similar to presidential reigns.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting.
I wonder, it's like the peak of their prime and their control. It's like they have a term limit.
It is interesting because regardless of age as well, so it doesn't really feel like, there is like at Ngogo, there's an average sort of expectancy of alphaship, and I think that's 6 or 7 years, and that's why we knew that Jackson at the start of when we were filming, we knew that he was entering a period where things could get tricky for him because he'd been in charge for about 6 years. And it is very interesting that tends to be the term. And the longer the study goes on for, the more interesting those things become. Because I think in the early days, when they were first observing the chimps, they were like, okay, well, he was in charge for 3 years, he was in charge for 7, and, there didn't seem to be any pattern. So it was all sort of, well, you're just at the top until someone knocks you off. But it does seem interesting that they don't see them lasting that much longer. They expect them not to stay there for much longer.
Is there any evidence that they learn from the chimps that are successful and they mimic this sort of political behavior and sort of like social awareness of keeping everybody happy and sort of like governing and, in a sort of an effective, sort of harmonious way?
Well, whether they see other chimps doing well through that, I don't know. I think that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, actually. I mean, there's leaders they adopt different strategies individually, and definitely the ones that are better at managing their political relationships and their allies, they stay in power longer and they have an easier time of it. Like Bartok, these are chimps that passed long before this series, but you'd be interested in it. Bartok is a small guy. Always looked big when he was alpha because they tend to they just hold themselves differently. So they puff their hair out. It's called piloerect when they stick all their hair goes on, and it literally gives them a different silhouette, a different body shape. And so when you are alpha, you tend to look bigger anyway. But even when he was like that, he didn't look as big as the other chimps. He was a relatively small chimp, but he was the longest serving alpha they've ever had at Ngogo. So he was the most successful leader there. And it was right at a time when Ngogo was still one massive group. So he probably was leader at the time when the group was biggest for the longest period. And he was also the smallest guy they've ever had in charge. And they put all that down to he was extremely good at keeping his relationships going with all the other big males. So all the big guys that could threaten him, he was grooming them all the time, keeping them happy.
Wow. And what happens to them when they get overthrown? Do they just assume a lesser position?
They do. I mean, they at Ngogo, they tend to, everything is okay after that. Like they might get beaten up badly in the overthrow. They might get a bit injured there, but it's never been lethal at Ngogo. Whereas at other sites, I've heard that alphas have been killed. They've been killed in the transfer of power. Interestingly, that's never happened in Go-Go. They, the incoming, there could well be a big fight and some minor injuries, but then that's it. And there's a new dominance hierarchy established. And as long as the outgoing alpha is submitting to the incoming one in the formal way, the pant grunt, whenever he comes by, then that's just, okay, we've sorted this out. We now know, like, he's on top. And the other chimps know. But what happens then is they can sometimes retain a sort of high position in the hierarchy. Like Miles, for instance, who's Jackson's giant friend. He was alpha for quite a brief period. And then, I can't remember who was after, and then I think could have been Jackson actually who took it off Miles. Miles remained high up there in number 2 and number 3 spot. He's always remained powerful. But some of them, Bartok, I think just after he left the alpha position, he just began the trajectory down the hierarchy and just retired. And he was out of it. It's like, not competing anymore. I'm old, I'm done.
They just accept a new position.
Yeah, and they really drop down, all the way down the hierarchy. They're no longer competing in the higher levels of the dominance hierarchy. They retire from that.
Are you aware of Robert Sapolsky's work with baboons?
No.
Sapolsky spent a lot of time embedded with baboons, and one of the things that he observed that's incredibly unusual is there was a group of baboons that was eating food that was in garbage that was from, I believe it was a resort. And these particularly ruthless alphas who would have first access to all this kind of food, they got poisoned because they ate this bad food, and they wound up dying. And it completely changed the way they behave with each other. The ruthless alphas died, and all of a sudden it became this sort of utopian civilization amongst baboons where they didn't exhibit any of that barbaric behavior. And they were much more kind to each other.
That, I didn't know. That is fascinating, and that just shows the outsized impact some individuals can have on the overall sort of culture of a group, right?
Much like humans.
Yeah.
Yeah.